Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So this is part 2 of this lecture. This is going to lead us to, I think you will understand this better after you listen to this part, because this is explaining those aspects. So the question is that basic methodology of science involves building models. So we need to understand what is a model and how does it relate to reality. And again, the question, the way that this is answered by standard economists, actually they don't really discuss this very much, but the implicit uh, answer to this question is wrong, and that's what creates confusion about this idea of what is objective and what is subjective. These things are very much confused in the issue of models. So we are going to take this very practically because I'm going to examine economic models, theory models, and then we are going to construct alternative models. But the issue is, what is a model? What does it help us to do? What a model is not? So, for example, the idea that human beings are utility maximizers or that firms are profit maximizers, these are models of behavior. The production function is a model of how an economy works to produce goods. The example of equilibrium as a method which generates prices. This is a model of how prices are determined. So from the start, it seems clear that these models are not true in the sense that we know that human beings are not utility maximizers. But then if they're not true, then how can they be helpful? So here is an illustration of some models that there is a bicycle race. The bicyclist is trying to get to a place, and so the model just puts the path as a straight line, but the reality is that the path is rather complex. There are valleys and jungles and lakes in the middle and so on. So similarly, the world itself is curved. It's not even a sphere as pictured. It's a more irregular surface. But when we construct a model of it, it becomes a flat map. So obviously there's a distortion. So one thing that is immediately clear is that models are not the same as a reality. And unfortunately, this is often, this has been a constant problem throughout, that people, it's called mistaking the map for the territory. And there are many other names in our own Eastern tradition. We say, do not mistake the finger. The finger points at the moon, but it is not the moon. So this is the mistake that is often made, that the symbol for a thing is taken to be the thing itself. So this is a common confusion, happens very frequently. So we have to keep the two things separate. An important and useful illustration of the difference between models and reality is the process by which we see things, which was discovered by Ibn al-Haytham, optics, and Newton basically wrote a book on optics, which is more or less a copy of what Ibn al-Haytham did. No significant new discoveries by Newton in this area. So in optics, you see, there is a real object which is out there in the real world. This picture shows, as there's a woman. The light comes from this object and enters the eye, and then there is an image formed on the retina. The image is actually the reverse of the what is there in the real world. It is not, and furthermore, the image is flat. The real world is three-dimensional. Then at the third stage, so we can think of the model as the image of reality. So now the model is completely different. When we talk about the model, then it is a, is a pattern of light and shadow on the retina. When you talk about the reality, it's completely different. It's made of substance, atoms, and things, and it's three-dimensional and it has weight. But the pattern of light, and it doesn't have any weight. So the model's characteristics are very different from the characteristics of reality. But the model by itself is not enough. And what happens next is that we interpret this model to form a picture of the reality. So this is a complicated three-stage process by which we understand the world. Now, this process gets eclipsed. What we think is that the model is what I'm seeing is the world out there. This is exactly confusing the model with reality, because actually what we are seeing is the image on the retina. We're not seeing the world out there. But the two are uh, considered as equals, except sometimes when you see optical illusions. So that there are many situations where you can create optical illusions so that the mind misinterprets the image on the retina, and um, then he can make mistakes in looking at and understanding. Like the most famous example is that of the water, which appears to be the mirage. So, because of certain patterns of light and reflection and heat and sand, people in the desert can see what looks like a body of water in front of them. And this is so dangerous that people can lose their lives. They are very thirsty in the desert and they see water in front, and then they keep chasing after it, and it keeps getting further and further because it's an optical illusion. It's not really there. So there you can differentiate between the image on the retina and the reality, and that the two are not the same. But often it is not possible. So we have no access to reality except through observations. Observations are not reality. And there are three different things. And in order to understand models, we have to keep all these three things in mind. There's the reality out there. Then there is the observation of reality, which is like the image on the retina. Then there is our mental model, which takes the observation and organizes it systematically into some pattern that we can understand and interpret. So there are these three different things. Um, and basically, philosophy is about sorting all of these three things and arranging them. And different people arrange things in different ways, and that gives them different interpretations and understanding of what models are. So the original and classical understanding of models, which is actually the correct understanding which exists in our tradition, but which has been rejected by modern methodologies, there is something which is called the Platonic world of ideals. Arabic, it's called alamul mithal. So there is this mental reality. We can imagine things which are not there in the real world. And our process of thinking operates in this alam al misal, in this world of perfection and ideals. There are many examples of ideals. For example, there's the perfect circle which exists in our mind. There is the Euclidean line. The Euclidean line is something which can only exist in our imagination because it goes from minus infinity to plus infinity. Reality is finite. It doesn't go from minus infinity to infinity. So there are things like abstractions, red. Now, what is this red? Now, is there any red in the real world? No. Red is an abstract concept. I can point to red objects. This is a red sweater. This is a red. But this is a category which exists in my mind. It doesn't exist in the real world. Like when I say Pakistan, this is a category which exists in the minds of human beings. It doesn't exist in the physical world. If all the human beings were destroyed tomorrow and somebody came to the world, an alien, and we asked him, well, where is Pakistan? He wouldn't be able to know because this is only a mental reality. It doesn't exist in the geography of the planet. So there is a alam al-misal, there is a world of imagination, and this world is very powerful. It governs what we do. Pakistan is a real concept. When people first hear this, they are taken aback. They think that Pakistan is a physical reality. It exists in the rocks and the trees and the lakes, but it is not a physical reality. It's not part of the geographical reality of physical. It's not objective reality. It is a subjective reality. This is what is partly an answer to you. We think what we think is objective is not actually. Um, can there be anything more objective than saying that Pakistan is a country which is located as a neighbor of India? This seems like a very objective statement, but it is actually subjective in the sense that it is a part of our collective understanding. We have all agreed as human beings to the idea that there exists something called Pakistan, and it is defined by certain boundaries and it has certain properties. Similarly, the idea of family, the idea of relationships, all of these are subjective realities. So, basically, models exist in the Platonic world of ideals. They do not exist in the real world. So, the question then arises in the Western history of philosophy of science. Hume realized that there are certain real phenomena which are not reflected in the observations. This is very important. So, for example, causation. Such and such a thing is the cause, X is the cause of Y. This is something which is true in the real world, but at the level of observations, we cannot see causation. This is a rather deep understanding that causation refers to if X is a cause of Y, then whenever X happens, then Y will happen next necessarily. Now, the point is that in order to find this out, you have to run this experiment in a hypothetical world. You have to do this many different times, rerun the time, go backward in time, do this to see if it happened, and then don't do this and see that don't do X and then see that Y will not happen in order to learn about causation. In reality, we only see one sequence of events. So what Hume said was that you cannot see causation in the real world. In the appearances, you only see that first X happened and then Y happened. So you can see temporal sequencing, but you cannot see causation. And so now the thing is that, and this is just one thing, there are many other things that you cannot see, like what Kant realized that we cannot see time and space. They don't exist in reality. Now, the thing is that what Kant saw was that science depends on these real phenomena. Science depends on the existence of time and space and causation and many other things. If we just look at appearances, again, exactly like the positivist problem, that if we say that there is no gravity, or we don't take any position in gravity, and we say that okay, the only thing that we understand is the elliptical orbits, and gravity is just shorthand for expressing this observation. This doesn't work. You have to posit some real phenomena. So what Kant said is that so Kant came to a realization. He said that he realized that mental models can never be pictures of reality. So he said that the idea, so basically he said that philosophy has been concerned with the following idea. Do our mental models describe reality? Is my mental model a very good match for what is real? He said that this question itself is a wrong question. So this was a major blunder that Kant made, and this blunder set the whole of Western philosophy astray. So his idea was accepted. He said that this question itself is meaningless. You cannot examine the match, and the logic of this is very perfect. He says that we don't have any access to reality. He says the only thing we can observe is observations. What is behind these observations, which he called thing in itself. There is the thing that you see, and then there's the hidden reality of the thing. That thing in itself is not accessible to us. It may exist. In fact, he says that of course it exists. Reality does exist, but I have no access to it. So let's not talk about that thing about which. So Wittgenstein said that do not talk about those things which you don't know anything about. So the real reality, the hidden reality, you will never know anything about it. You can only see the phenomena, what you observe. He said, let's talk about what we can observe. So let's talk about observations and our mental models. Now, our mental models go beyond the observations. That's very clear. That our mental models, we take a flat two-dimensional object on our screen, on the retina, and then we convert it to three dimensions. Where did this three dimensions come from? I never saw anything three-dimensional. So he says that what we do, the mind has certain powers. And he says that the three-dimensional time-space is a construct of the mind. Similarly, causality is a construct of our mind. And so this was his clever solution to the problem. But this was the wrong solution. Unfortunately, the West is still following this wrong solution. Although Kant's position has been drastically changed and modified and updated, and people have rejected Kantian philosophy, although there are still neo-Kantians who follow his idea. So there's a long and complicated story, but it's all stuck in this same pattern that, okay, there are observations and there's the mind, and but we cannot access reality. This part is agreed upon. And that's what positivists also say, that reality is not going to be uh, under discussion here. So the problem is that how can mental models be useful even though they're not, mental models are in the Platonic world, they're not real. So what use is a mental model if it is not real? So unfortunately, in the West, what happened was that they had this idea, which is still very persistent idea. This is called binary logic. Either something is true or it's false. Now, Islam has a much deeper understanding, which is what Iqbal has expressed, that मुकाम अक्ल से आसान गुजर गया Iqbal. So the binary logic says that a statement is either true or it's false. If it's true, it's good. If it's false, it's no good. So Kant said that here is a model. Is the model the same as reality? No. Models are false. So then he says that looking for a match between model and reality is useless. Now this is the mistake. Now the issue is that the model can be false in the sense that it doesn't provide an accurate picture of reality, but it can still be useful. In fact, more recently in statistics, somebody came to the realization that all models are false, and that's correct. But that was Box, I think he said this. Maybe it was somebody else. And but some models are still useful. So this is exactly the correct picture, that all models are false, but some models are useful. Then the question becomes, which are the useful models? How do we know what is useful? So now what happened is that in the West, they had this idea that if something is false, then it's not useful. There were two major factors. There was this binary logic, that either it's true or it's false. So people say that if the model is false, then it's useless. So what we are doing is we need to do is to find true models. Other people who realized that this doesn't work, and they developed other ways, instrumentalism and other philosophies to get over this. Anyway, this problem is too complicated, and I'm oversimplifying the picture. But basically, the issue of how can a false model be useful, this issue has not been understood clearly in Western philosophy and methodology due to certain blinders. There's the search for certainty. In the West, knowledge is defined to be something which is called a justified true belief. This definition of knowledge came up after the rejection of Christianity as the dominant one. It had existed before, but it was not, because they said that, look, everybody believed in Christianity, but it turned out to be not true. So it was what people thought was not knowledge. So uh, in order to for something to be knowledge, it must be true. Otherwise, if something is false, it cannot be knowledge. Again, this creates a problem because our models are not true, but they are useful anyway. So false things can be part of knowledge, in contradiction to the standard theory of knowledge, which is currently dominant in the West. And then it has to be justified. It's not just that something is true, you have to be able to prove that it is true. If I say that there is one God, and I say it is true, that's not enough. That's not part of knowledge, because I have to produce a proof for this. So that's what justified means. So um, the search for the definition of knowledge in this way ruled out many, many important and actually essential parts of knowledge. In this world, we operate on the basis of imperfect and uncertain knowledge every day. Here I am communicating with you. By looking at your faces, I can get some idea of whether or not you are following me as an experienced teacher. But what is really in your heart, I can never find out. But if I didn't have this imperfect understanding, I would not be able to operate as a human being. Every day we meet people, we make friends, we make enemies, we make people angry, we make people happy. We can never look at what is inside the heart, but without knowing these things, and this is part of my knowledge. If I say that no, unless I can write down a proof that I have made him happy, then I will not consider this knowledge. I will not be able to operate as a human being. So our knowledge, 99% of human knowledge is uncertain and completely unprovable. It is impossible to get a proof that this person's heart became happy when I said that you are looking good today. It's impossible. But I operate on the guess that this might be true, and this is essential to my living. So most of the knowledge that we have is uncertain. So in the West, there was something which was called the quest for certainty. We can only count something as knowledge if it is true, but and provable. But there is no such knowledge. They were looking for unicorns which don't exist. But um, but unfortunately, with this, so then they made many mistakes because of this quest for certainty. And they missed the correct understanding which is required. So let us think about how this worked in the field of econometrics. Because the same thing is true in economics, but it's much easier to understand in econometrics. So econometrics is a search for patterns in the data. You look at the data and you say, oh, these two variables are moving together. That is pattern in the data. So on the basis of the pattern, if there's a strong pattern, you have a regression line. If there's a weak pattern, then you say the relation is not there. So what is it good for? It's useful for forecasting. And it's good for explanation. You see, these two variables move together, so if I move one of them, the other one will move correspondingly. That is what econometrics is all about. So forecasting means that if a pattern existed in the past, it will also exist in the future. This is all completely wrong. This is a nominalist philosophy, which is based on positivist ideas. What is a realist philosophy, which is the counter, which is the correct understanding? The correct understanding says that if I look at a pattern, well, how did this pattern come into existence? What is the hidden reality which is creating this pattern? So, for example, if I see that the consumption and the income are moving together, then I don't say that C is equal to alpha plus beta Y. I say that actually what happens is that when people get incomes, they use this to buy products. So I have an understanding of the reality between the hidden reality which is producing this pattern. So once I have the knowledge of the hidden reality, then I can say that this is a pattern, so it will persist because it is it is created by a true underlying hidden reality. As opposed to this, suppose I see a pattern in the past 20 elections, every presidential candidate who won the New Hampshire primary also won the US presidential election. So I can say, okay, there's a very strong pattern here. It cannot happen by chance. The chances are 1 over 2 to the 20 of this. So then I can say that, all right, so in the future, this will also continue to happen. Well, there's no real uh, force behind, there's no real hidden cause which would cause this to happen, that the New Hampshire primary winner would also win the US. So this is an accidental pattern. So some patterns are accidental, some patterns are real. So if you forecast on the basis of false patterns, you will get wrong forecasts. So basically, the correct way to do econometrics is to look at the hidden realities. But the positivist says that you don't look for hidden realities. So that's why currently econometrics is a pathetic exercise. Anybody can prove anything that they like. They can take any two data series and prove that one data series has a strong regression on the other by doing some sort of manipulations. I know exactly how to do it, and I can teach this how to take any two variables and prove that there is a strong relationship between them. Because we're only looking for patterns, and by looking for patterns, you can always create a pattern when there is none. So the same thing is true of economics also. The economists also look for models which explain observations without worrying about whether the model is real or not. So as I explained in another class, that somebody wants to explain the pattern of taxes in the USA. So Aumann and Kurtz wrote a paper in which they said that let us imagine a game in which the majority coalition can impose whatever tax it wants to on the minority coalition. So what would the outcomes of such a game be? So they found out that the outcome of this game would be that the majority would form and it would take everything away from the minority. So they said, well, this doesn't match what we observe. The tax is not that the majority takes everything away from the poor. So tax rates are reasonable. So they said, okay, so this game doesn't work to explain reality. So let's modify it by making one additional rule. They said that if somebody imposes a tax rule, then the person who is being taxed, he has one other option. He can either submit to the tax or he can just burn all his property. So now when you put that second rule into the picture, now it turns out that the majority coalition cannot impose very heavy taxes. So now the tax pattern looks more similar to what we observe in reality. This is say, okay, now we have a good model because our model produces observations which match reality. This is a paper which is published in Econometrica, and this illustrates the totally hopeless methodology. I mean, obviously, if we think about what are the if we look at the US tax structure and we ask how did this tax structure emerge? So there are lots of things there. There's power play and politics, and this, in fact, the current taxes are taking away money from the poor, which is the majority, and giving it to the rich, which is a very small minority, and there's very complex reasons. So to think that this model has anything to do with explanation is just because of very, very defective methodology, which is currently dominant in the West. So now we come to human behavior. Again, economists say that the Homo economicus is a model for human behavior, and the Homo economicus is a robot who maximizes utility at all times. So now we argue that Homo economicus doesn't describe human behavior. So they say what Friedman says and what other economists would say in response to this. I mean, many people have already said that Homo economicus is not a good description. It doesn't matter, because what is the hidden reality inside the human heart is not of any concern to us. All we want to show is that there is a match between the observations and the predictions of our model. This is what Friedman's as if methodology says, the very famous essay that you see when data emerged, that very strong data that firms do not maximize profits. So what Friedman said is that, and how did this data that people asked the managers, what do you do? And they found that they do basically markup on costs and they do many other things, but they don't maximize profits. They don't usually have a very good idea of what these profits are. And the actions they do are not designed to maximize profits. So this was a very big contradiction to economic theory. So Friedman came up with a defense of economic theory. He says that, you know, what the managers say they do does not matter. If they did not maximize profits, they would not survive. We have already discussed the evolutionary arguments earlier. Furthermore, it doesn't matter. The model is always an oversimplification, as we have said. It doesn't actually match reality. The only thing it needs to do is to produce predictions which match observations. Now, it turns out that even this level of reality is not achieved by the neoclassical models. My paper called Empirical Evidence Against Neoclassical Utility Theory is exactly designed to take this argument on its home ground. So I say, all right, we will confine discussion only to empirical observations, not to theoretical. I mean, I'm not going to argue that it's ridiculous to think that human beings behave just in the face of, just because of they are motivated by money. That is a correct argument, but it's not acceptable to positivists. So I say, okay, let's look at the empirical data, and I show that empirically this idea of utility maximization is violated. So even at the observational level, the economic theories don't match the data. So even on their home ground, it is not a valid theory. But basically, the whole idea, it's not a correct understanding of the issue that is at stake. It is not the, because basically the idea that our theories should produce observation match is not enough. We need to have some match at the reality level, but it's not, the match is not that of identity. That's what Kant made the mistake of. He said that the model should be the same as reality, and he realized that it cannot be true. So the model has to have a match with reality, but the match is not at the is not that of equivalence or identity. The model is more complex relationship between models and reality, which doesn't have to do with true and false. And this is the problem: the binary understanding that things have to be either true or false. This led them into not understanding the real theory of models. So the correct understanding of models are all models are wrong, but still some models are useful. So the central question becomes how to differentiate between useful and useless models. This is exactly what Islam teaches us. There's harmful knowledge and there's useful knowledge and useless knowledge. Now we have to understand what is useless knowledge, which models are bad and harmful, and which models are good and useful. Uh, Current theory, yani current methodology in the West only gives one answer. A model is useful if it produces a match to the observation. If you have a regression model and it has a high R squared, it is a good model because it is a good match. But this is not true. A model can have very high R squared and it can be a very bad model. And we can, if it is not, if the model does not correspond to some real phenomena. So if I look at, as I said, in fact, you can have very high R squared by, actually I did it. If you look at the consumption of Australians and run a regression of this on the GDP of China, you get a wonderful regression. So, I mean, and how did I find it? I ran all consumptions on all countries and I looked for the best. So I found out that an excellent regression is obtained by looking at the consumption of China, Australia, and regressing it on the GNP of China. So this is a great model because it's an excellent fit, but it does not correspond to any real phenomena, so it's a bad model. So differentiating between a pattern that you see and the hidden reality which produces the pattern, that is essential to understanding the difference between a useful model and a useless model. So economists look for good models according to two criteria. One is that the observations should match. The other is also that the axioms of the model, the way it is built, should be according to optimization and equilibrium. This is also the economist's criteria of a good model. If you say that people are behaving at random, then the economists say this model is wrong because human behavior has to be optimizing behavior. If you look at Varian, he starts by saying that these are the two assumptions that we make which are fundamental. Every human person optimizes, and we will study only equilibrium. We will not study disequilibrium. So both of these are both of these are characteristics that your model should have if the model is going to be acceptable to an economist. But both of these are just wrong ideas about models. So the first answer of the economist and the second answer, both of them are based on their understanding of methodology, and both of these answers are wrong. So what is the right answer? Well, good models are good guesses at the underlying reality, at the mechanisms of the underlying reality which generate the observations. Now, one of the major issues is that it is impossible to be certain about good models. And this is why the Western methodology does not accept this answer, because we will never be sure if our model is true or not. So it will never be, we can never justify this model. It's just a guess. Because as Kant realized correctly, reality is not accessible. We can only make guesses about it, and we can only see observations. We can never directly access the thing in itself. So that is true. So that means that we can make guesses, but that doesn't mean that we can retire. We can get rid of the thing in itself, which is what they have done. No, we have to make guesses because that's necessary. So some people are good at guessing how other people are feeling. Other people are bad at guessing. Nobody can ever know for sure. Certainty is denied. So there is no certainty. So that is the basic understanding. But there is a lot more that we need to understand about models. So useful models basically partition a very complex reality into small subsystems which can be understood. And then we try to understand different pieces of the system and then try to patch together our understanding. So now, how do we, so basically we have to find and isolate a small subsystem which can be understood. So the way that this is done, and we will study this specifically in concrete detail later on, is that we try to take um, a small system, and then we take inputs into that system. These inputs are called the exogenous variables. So the exogenous variables are left out of the picture. These are things we will not explain because we are trying to explain only one small part of the picture. So then this is a really crucial issue. What can we leave unexplained? So for example, in the demand and supply model, the tastes and the technology and the cost structure is taken as exogenous. And then we construct a model, it's a complicated model, which takes these things and creates supply curve and demand curve and equilibrium. This is all what we are explaining. This is the part. And then the output of the system is a price, the equilibrium price. So here, so this is one way of looking at the world. Now, uh, there are serious problems arise if the inputs are not exogenous, because basically the system that you're studying should not interfere with the inputs. If the system is producing the inputs, then you're saying, I take this thing as given, but it is not given. It's being produced by the system. So this is a major objection to the demand and supply, which we have already studied, that if it is true that the producers who produce goods, the suppliers, also generate the demand for that supply by advertisement, which is exactly what John Kenneth Galbraith has said, that the industrial society works by massive overproduction, and then the producers advertise to generate the demand for these useless products. So if this is true, then we cannot validly take as input the tastes, because the tastes are not exogenous, they are created by the system. So um, sometimes this exogeneity is clear, sometimes this is indirect and subtle. What happens is that the output is the price, and then the price goes back, and there's something which is called a feedback loop. So then basically the concept of exogeneity and endogeneity has to be understood very clearly in order to do modeling correctly. And unfortunately, it is not explained clearly or accurately in economics. So if there is a if the system that you're studying produces some output, that output cannot be taken as exogenous. And again, the system should be, what we are trying to do is isolate simple structures which we can understand. This is another important thing, because models are meant to help us understand a complex reality. So the model should be a simple picture of a complicated reality. And once you do that, you understand that it's clear that this simple picture will not match reality, but the model helps us to identify that these are the important factors which you need to take into account, and the other things, like if I want to study human behavior, um, Nisa has a huge number of characteristics. I can measure the size of her fingers, and I can find out the size of her shoes, but this will not influence her behavior. So these are things which can ignore. Actually, it's not necessarily true that we can ignore. They have minor impacts. All of these things matter, but so the model will ignore all of these things because we want to simplify. We want to take away inessential complications.